end. So people are still coming in, and while they do, I will mention that it's the third day of GIFcon, and it's a real pleasure to see loads of people coming in still to this day. Grace is just inviting you to stick your location in the chat and remind us where you all are. It's wonderful to hear news of all these places tuning in. Here in Glasgow, as Grace says, it's an uncharacteristically sunny day, and we're all thrilled about that. But it's been great over the last few days of the conference to see just how much of the world has a stake in GIFcon. And every panel I've been in, every conversation I've been in has just been thrilling. I'll remind you as more people are continuing to connect about what's going on today. This is the first event and the last keynote, but there's still plenty to come after this. We've got another session of panels 15 minutes after this ends on interrogating television, conjuring utopia, and rewriting history. There is a plenary roundtable on conjuring creatures and worlds in young adult fantastica. That's a roundtable that's happening at 3 o'clock BST. And then there is a networking event that's at 4:15, but you need to have signed up for that, and it is now sold out. So sorry if you didn't get there in time. For people who have the links to that, that's happening at 4:15. Our panel 8 goes into the British evening, but it's hopefully therefore more accessible to some people in other time zones. That's panel 8, which happens at 5:15, Experiencing Change in Fantasy, the Other, and Body Transformation. And the last event of the entire conference happens at 6:45 p.m. BST, and that's the third research spotlight with Anna Millen and Tom Emmanuel, which will be happening in the Voice Discord channel. Those spotlights have been really good, so do tune in for those. Right now, though, it's a pleasure to introduce Zen Cho. Zen was born and raised in Malaysia and lives in the UK. She writes fantasy and romance. Her titles include The Sorcerer to the Crown historical fantasy novels, 2015 and 2019, and Malaysian contemporary fantasy Blackwater Sister, 2021, as well as the Lambda Award-nominated novella The Order of the Pure Moon, Reflected in Water, 2020. And a short story collection, Spirits Abroad, 2021. Her newest novel, The Friend Zone Experiment, is a contemporary romance set among London's East and Southeast Asian community. And I'm particularly looking forward, Zen, to talking to you about that. Zen is a winner of the Hugo, Crawford, and British Fantasy Awards, and the LA Times Ray Bradbury Prize, as well as a finalist for the World Fantasy Ignite, Locus, Astounding, Kitschy, and Diverse Book Awards. Her short fiction has been translated into French, Spanish, Italian, Finnish, Chinese, and Japanese. She's spoken at literary festivals and conventions, taught creative writing, appeared on the radio, and was once a model in a campaign for a global luxury makeup brand. Lots to talk about and an enormous amount of expertise and experience to bring to our conference. Zen, thank you so much for coming. It's so nice to talk to you. I want to start by talking to you about conjuring creatures, which is our theme for this year. And I will pop into the chat right now a link to one of your stories that is where I want to start this conversation, in case some people haven't read this one yet. It's the one that won you the Hugo, so I think it's a nice place to start. But it's also got a really good conjured creature in it, an imugi. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
I think so. I don't speak Korean, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a Korean mythological creature. But I can tell you about how I came to write about it.
Please do. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I had a horrible time writing my second novel, The True Queen, which was the follow-up from Sorcerer to the Crown. I've heard this from quite a lot of other authors, where the book that you work on after your kind of debut, and actually my debut was Spirits Abroad, but it was originally published by kind of Malaysian indie press, and then I self-published the ebook, and it wasn't kind of to the scale of Sorcerer to the Crown, which was my first novel, which was published by a kind of big five publisher and reasonably buzzy and this sort of thing. And I think once you have that level of attention on you, it's just an emotional shift from when you're kind of working away in your little cave and nobody really cared what you're doing. I think I think the writers in this audience will recognize the kind of need to retreat to the cave, and forget about the market, forget about all those pressures and reader expectations. But I had a horrible time writing Choking because I couldn't get that conceptual cave around me. And but when I finally managed to do a draft that worked and turned it in, and it was accepted and so on, I had this enormous sense of freedom. And that's when I wrote, If at first you don't succeed, try again. And it came from a conversation I was having with some friends, which included a couple of Korean American friends. And one of them said, "Oh, I really enjoy the story of Imugi, which is kind of proto-dragon. It's a Korean, there's a Chinese version as well, but this is specifically the kind of Korean version." And she said there are lots of kind of stories about, kind of wicked Imugi who kind of give up on becoming dragons, and they sort of they go off and start eating people, which usually East Asian dragons don't do. They're not the kind of carnivorous kind of dragon, and they're more associated with kind of affecting the weather, they rule over kingdoms in the sea, that kind of thing. So and funnily enough, I think the Imugi, the proto-dragon, the kind of wicked ones, the stories are a little bit more like kind of the stories of Western dragons, where they kind of prey on people, eat monks, and so on. And there was something about that idea of a creature, a being who just decides to not follow the path set out for it and just revel in failure, that just really attracted me at that time. I was thinking a lot about kind of failure and success and what that meant to me creatively. So a lot of the story is a not very veiled metaphor for kind of struggling to write. So there's a kind of bit where Biam, the kind of Imugi, who's striving to become a dragon and facing lots of challenges doing it, starts kind of reeling off aphorisms, to itself, and like real dragons never give up and that kind of thing. And that was all kind of lifted directly from the very prolific genre of kind of writing advice on the internet, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, so that's kind of where it came from. And in the story, what Biam is aspiring to is basically to study the way, which is just the way of all things, kind of the inherent knowledge of the universe, the wisdom of the universe, and become, sufficiently well versed in it to ascend to heaven, and become a dragon. So it's specifically not a Christian heaven. It's a kind of Chinese, well, East Asian heaven, I suppose, where kind of celestial fairies and dragons hang out. Um, so as part of this, they will also receive the Chintamani, the kind of as you wish orb, as you were, a kind of pearl. So if you see East Asian dragons, often they're depicted like chasing up a kind of pearl, and that's kind of what I had in mind. But so my summary of the story is that maybe the real Chintamani were the friends we made along the way. Um, so that's kind of what it's about. So BM is failing in its quest, and it eventually meets a human who was involved in thwarting it. But then finds, I guess, isn't digressing from the quest, but then finds that there was kind of a value in the digression. And spoilers, does actually achieve its attain its dreams eventually.
And there's another interesting layer on that, I suppose, because if that was a sort of slightly digressive thing for you, then the value was the prize. Was it
Right.
a surprise? How did it feel? What's it like to win a Hugo?
So I wrote the story because I had this idea and I thought this is really cute. And actually, like I kind of like harassed my Korean American friends to give me kind of like it was very difficult to research emoji. Like in English there are very limited sources, so I got them to kind of tell me some like like kind of common folk tales. And they actually came up with the name as well. One of them came up with the name Biang, which is a kind of a Korean dialect word for snake. I
Mm.
wanted a kind of name that wasn't a real name. And basically, the idea is that after you ascend and you become a dragon, then you merit a real name, like a proper name that has a meaning and so on. And so Biam is this kind of like, seeking validation. Um, but so I wrote it for myself, but then once it was published, what happened was I think Worldcon was going to be in Dublin, and I don't usually go to Worldcon because a lot of the time it takes place in the States, notwithstanding its name. But when it comes to Europe, I usually try to get there. Because and Dublin was obviously a lot more accessible to me in the UK. And I thought, well, it's very shallow. But I thought it was at the time that George R. R. Martin still hosted these Hugo Losers parties, and I thought I want to go to the Hugo Losers party. And a way to get what I subsequently discovered is loads of people get in with having no connection to the Hugos. They don't, even if you're not fine, they kind of get like, through connections, whatever. But me being very kind of like, kind of I play by the rules, and so I was like, oh, so the way to do it is to get nominated, right? Because you get to go even if you win, which I hadn't really thought about that piece. I thought I'll get nominated. And the advantage of if at first you don't succeed, I didn't kind of design this, but the advantage is that it's novelette length, and actually the novelette category I would say is one of the least competitive if you're gonna go for it. So this is my recommendation, right? If you're trying to rig the Hugos, is write a novelette, because like short story is really competitive and then novel is madly competitive, but actually novelette's kind of one of these random ones where people don't care that much. So I did a little bit of campaigning like on social media. I posted the link. I asked people to nominate me. But I was open about it. I said, it's because I want to go to this party. So I did get nominated. I thought, brilliant, I've done it. And so the winning it was very much secondary. I didn't really think of that aspect, but obviously it was a very pleasant surprise. And I've got the Hugo now. If you want to, it's on my windowsill. It's got a kind of Celtic design at the bottom.
Hey.
There it is. Extremely phallic design.
So did you get to go to the losers? Presumably not, because you won.
Well, no, you are allowed in if you win.
You're allowed in. Okay.
But you have to wear a silly hat, and they mock you, but they don't do it very hard because often they're American, and Americans aren't very good, I think, at ribbing. The kind of British people are much better at it. Not to mention the Irish. But yeah, but that was the year. I mean, I'm getting a bit too much into kind of science fiction, fantasy, drama. And that was the year that George R. R. Martin was a bit too generous with the invitations, and people actually were being refused at the door. So there was quite a lot of controversy about it. But I did manage to get in actually, and I got my silly hat and so on, and it was quite fun.
Fantastic. Going back to the, and I don't want to. I mean, I do want to just talk about this one short story for now, but we mustn't. But just very quickly, going back to the way, one thing that's really striking about the story is that the way includes astrophysics. So there's this lovely moment where the not yet dragon, the Amugi, is kind of in an astrophysicist's office. I won't give too much away, but looks around and instead of being sort of flawed by modern knowledge or whatever, it's like, oh, you're studying the same thing I've been studying all this time. I thought that was a really nice light kind of way of performing an intersection between different kinds of knowledge that are sometimes thought to be at odds with each other. I wonder if you have a comment on that, or more to say about how you were thinking about that sort of thing as you're making the rules of that world.
I don't know. I think it always came to me as a bit of a joke, but it also had a kind of inherent, like, it sort of made sense. Like it had made an emotional sense. The way obviously stands in for Tao, right? As in Taoism. And that seemed to all make sense with the kind of conceptual world that Biam comes from. So like as research for reading the story, I actually read the Samguk Yusa. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that's a kind of like historical Korean like book. It's like a collection of legends and folk tales and historical accounts of and it's one of these things where when you read it without any context, and I was reading this very poor ebook poorly formatted ebook, zero footnotes. So like you're kind of at sea half the time because you don't have the historical or cultural reference to make sense of all of this. But I read it anyway to try to just get a bit of a a feel for the world that I felt BM was should be coming from, because in the story it sort of talks about it's over thousands of years that it lives, and I was kind of interested, and I knew as it kind of came, it went through the ages. It goes from a kind of really kind of vague fantasy world where pre-industrial and so on, and into a very immediate kind of modern day, where the astrophysicist is posting on Instagram about sighting in a Mugi, and I think, and it was trying. I think I enjoy writing characters that are entering kind of places that are new to them and to which they are kind of foreign or alien, and that I guess that was part of that Biam is kind of seeing this modern world in its own in its own context, and fitting it into its framework. So it's kind of seeing the knowledge that the astrophysicist has as actually being connected with the knowledge that it's been studying for all these years. So, why shouldn't there be a connection?
Yeah. We must move on from that one story. Conjuring creatures. What is your favorite creature? Staying for a moment within kind of the fantasy world.
Um, well, dragons are a pretty obvious one. I'm not that interested in the Western dragon as much, unless I can kind of make it to a joke. But I think both the Western and East Asian dragons are like great for turning into a joke, because they've got all this like I don't know, this kind of conceptual weight to them that everyone has an idea of what a dragon is, and usually it's either terrifying or kind of quite dignified. And I think you turning that on its head and kind of seeing, and then making it a bit funny or vulnerable, or kind of bringing it down to a kind of human level, I quite enjoy. For a while, I had a kind of idea, and maybe I'll get to it someday, of me writing a book of kind of linked short stories called Dragon Stories for Stressed Millennials, where in each one, like a dragon would just face some very, very mundane problem. So if at first you don't succeed, obviously there's actually a kind of subplot about like not gaining tenure. And then I thought you could have one where like the dragon's trying to make rent or something, that kind of thing. I haven't done it yet. But yeah, but I think it's that contrast between that very, yeah, the kind of grandeur of the idea and the kind of fantasy of it with the everyday that I enjoy. I also like, so the other one that's kind of joint favorites, the Pontianak, which is a kind of you find it in Indonesia as well, like Southeast Asian, Malaysian hantu kind of demon, I guess, which is like a female vampiress almost. She kind of like stalks the roads at night, and she particularly preys on pregnant women and eats your insides, that kind of thing. And I've written stories about them there as well.
So at this point, I'll remind our attendees that if you want to think of a question for Zen, stick it in the Q&A thing along the bottom, and I'll come to those in just a moment. In the meantime, Zen, I think your last answer gives us a nice way into the next thing to talk about, which is that the novel you have coming out soon is not a fantasy novel. And paradoxically, perhaps for a fantasy conference, I want to spend a moment talking about that, because I think that's a really interesting, I suppose, professional transition to have been negotiating, but also an aesthetic one, because there are romance elements in so much of what you write, but shifting to genre romance with no fantastic elements is a really interesting decision to have made. So I wonder if you could talk about the friend zone experiment a little bit in terms of how it was kind of moving genres for you, and what that experience. I suppose the question I want to ask is, does your background as a fantasy author mean that you have written this romance novel differently from a normal romance novelist? How does that feel?
Yeah, I don't know if I've written it differently from a normal romance novelist. I think there's quite a lot of overlap, I think, in between romance and fantasy. writers. Particularly, I have a lot of Twitter mutuals who are historical romance writers. Maybe kind of naturally because I think Sorcerer to the Crown particularly drew on that genre. So Sorcerer to the Crown was I explicitly sat down and said to myself, right, I don't really know how to plot. So how about I kind of like steal the like structure of a Georgette Hare, Regency romance, and I just kind of put in some magic and like colonialism in it, and then see what happens. And that's what and Sorcerer to the Crown is what happened. Um, but I think it was an interesting transition and sort of unexpected. But in some ways, romance is more fantastical than a lot of fantasy.
For
It's
sure.
except that it's explicitly maybe a wish fulfillment fantasy. And I think what's interesting about it is the kind of the formula or the structure, the kind of mandatory happy ending and
Hmm.
happy for now, happy ever after, and all of that. And how I came to write it was kind of similar to if at first you don't succeed, in that it kind of came out of a period of time of pressure, of emotional kind of stress, and that in that case it was lockdown. Um, and I got really into K-dramas during that during that time. Um, and I particularly loved a K-drama called Crash Landing on You, which the premise sounds mad, but it actually really works. So it's about a South Korean heiress to a conglomerate who crash lands, who goes like God, what's the word? Skydiving or not skydiving? Um, what is it when you could like you're like flying in the air? Hang gliding, I think.
Yeah, sure. Yes.
Yeah, anyway, she gets caught up in a tornado, which is one of the fakest tornadoes you will ever see on screen.
Amazing.
And then and then crash lands. It's very Dorothy, and the Wizard of Oz. Crash lands in North Korea where she meets a really hot
Oh,
North
wow.
Korean soldier and they fall in love. But when I was watching it, because a friend highly recommended it to me, I was watching it and I was like, I'm not sure I'm gonna be able to invest in like a show that wants me to believe that a North Korean soldier is good, actually. But then, like, about 10 minutes in, I was like, okay, this is not a piece of realism. It's very much, it takes place in an emotional fantasy world, right? And but at the same time, it kind of I think it's quite respectful of its North Korean characters, and they had a North Korean advisor on the show, and it kind of deals, I think, to a degree with what it is like or what it must be like to live in a society like that, and in a kind of and it deals a bit but with that split, between North and South Korea. So I've actually got a friend who, like a K-drama watching friend who's like, I don't know why you'd be interested in Crash Landing on You if you're not from a former colony. And I kind of get it. Like,
Mm.
there's a kind of like post-colonial kind of thing going on there. Um, Anyway, I got really into Crash Landing on You, so it inspired me to write my own book. But instead of dealing with a kind of big geopolitical split, what I decided would be the overarching background conflict was a fictionalized version of the 1MDB corruption scandal in Malaysia. And I think I said this to you in the kind of chat we had before this, but for me, fantasy and actually romance have both been really helpful in that I think when I'm writing, I often need something to kind of distance myself from whatever it is, like serious issue it is I want to look at, whether that's, sexuality or whether that's like corruption, or complicity. Complicity seems to be a big thing with me. Um, and actually having that distance with that's introduced, whether it's by like talking dragons or the kind of like inherent kind of wish fulfillment fantasy and the kind of heightened emotional reality of a romance novel, is just really helpful for me. And I'm busy focusing on delivering the tropes that I as a reader find enjoyable, but then that somehow means at the same time I can be kind of thinking about these things that I find quite difficult, but that feel quite important to work through as well.
Yeah. I think, and this may be a mistaken, and perhaps there's someone on this meeting who who is doing this work, but I think that fantasy studies needs to think more about soaps and telenovelas and K-dramas and you know that's such an intriguing interaction. But while you were talking there about the friend-zone experiment, I was also thinking of Amar in Blackwater Sister, and this for those who haven't read it is a sort of is a story of someone building a relationship with her deceased grandmother who is haunting her. But in a really I think what I love about that is that the gran is not she's not like this perfect granny. In at some moments she's sort of the villain, and at some moments she's quite heroic and it's such a complex relationship that they build precisely because I think of what you were saying about sort of mixing the humor and the darkness of that sort of idea of, on the one hand, yeah, a spirit haunting, which is a dreadful thing, together with this kind of tender opportunity to repair a family, I suppose. And it's interesting that that's a fantasy novel where you're doing that, and so in some ways there's a continuity there.
Yeah, although it's a very grounded fantasy novel. And the kind of fantastical element is kind of focusing in on the kind of thing I wanted to explore with that was uh spirit mediumship, which is a kind of living religious practice and religious tradition. And I always do this when I talk about Blackwater Sisters. So let me see if I can get the book down. Seems appropriate at an academic conference. So I was actually inspired by this book, The Way That Lives in the Heart by Jean de Bernardi. The subtitle is Chinese Popular Religion and Spirit Mediums in Penang, Malaysia. And this is by an academic, a professor of anthropology in Canada who went to Penang in Malaysia in the 1980s and studied spirit mediumship. And I read this quite a few years ago, and I grew up around this religious practice, but my parents never really explained anything to me because it's very pantang or taboo, basically. And they didn't want to say anything that would offend anybody, by anybody meaning spirits and or gods, rather than people, you know. So actually the Way That Lives in the Heart was really helpful because she kind of talks about the kind of intellectual frameworks and narrative frameworks that the spirit mediums use and how they draw in Chinese classical literature and kind of, you know, all this stuff. And the stories are really good as well, like just some of the stuff in there. And actually the name Blackwater Sister came from this book. So there's a story anecdote from somebody she interviews about like an evil spirit that lives in an abandoned house called the Blackwater Aunt. And I needed a name for the goddess because I knew I was going to have this goddess. And I was like flipping through the book thinking, you know, there might be something in here. And I just happened on that. I was like, perfect. And what's really nice actually is I ended up corresponding with the author. So she heard of my book and she was like, "Oh, that's my goddess," because obviously the title, you know. And she wrote to me and said that this edition I've got was published by NUS Press, actually as in the National University of Singapore. But she said kind of as a result, this book has been reprinted by Stanford Press. So that's pretty cool. I think possibly one of the coolest things that ever happened as a result of my work. But yeah, but the point I was trying to get to originally is that although it is fantasy, it basically is fantasy in the sense that it treats things that people believe are true as though they are true. So I think one thing I'm often very interested in is kind of like how people view the world, and they're kind of like, I guess I feel like I'm overusing the words conceptual in this interview as though it's going to make it more like appropriate for an academic but basically how they think about things and how they perceive things and what they think to be real. And these different versions of reality stacking up on each other. And if you think about it, like everybody has their own specific version of reality, even if like my version of reality only differs from yours in that maybe you remember telling me that you bought, I don't know, a jacket yesterday and I've forgotten that. So my reality doesn't include that incident anymore. But yours does. And I think the clash of those different visions of reality, I think I'm very interested in. And I think fantasy is a great space to explore that.
it's kind of building on that. And by the way, just a reminder, put questions in the thing because I can and will just talk to Zen until 1:30 if you don't. But anyway, the thing that seems to come from that, I think, so you mentioned this sort of reluctance, and it's in Blackwater Sister as well, of the older generation to kind of even talk about these subjects just in case, someone or something gets offended. When it comes to then writing a fantasy novel out of these belief systems, using that as a sort of world-building ingredient, how does your relationship with it as a belief system alter doing that? I suppose this is a slightly strange way of asking a question about where the line is between fantasy authorship that is inspired by X or Y set of beliefs or cultural practices versus, I suppose, a sincere belief or a kind of adhering to that view of the world. How does that relationship play out for you?
I don't believe in ghosts myself, although what I always say is I'm slightly concerned that they don't care whether I believe in them or not. But like it's I think it's a way of engaging with those beliefs for sure. And maybe working out what I think about them. And but I think there's just because you tell a story about something doesn't mean it's not true. It doesn't mean you don't believe it. Um, and and fiction I find as a writer of fiction is a really kind of nice space to kind of work, kind of grapple with things that you're not sure about. Because any conclusion that you reach, you can't necessarily be held to, even by yourself.
Ah,
And I think, and one thing I want to say as well is when you kind of talking through your question, it made me think about it's. I think uh, the kind of Western approach to religion is quite different from the approach in other places. And one thing I'm thinking about is this adaptation of Journey to the West that I was really into when I was a kid. So this it was like a TVB TV series made in Hong Kong, with starring Dickie Cheong as the monkey god, or Sun Wukong, the main character of Journey to the West. Journey to the West being one of the four great kind of Chinese classics, right? But quite a few of, certainly Sun Wukong, the monkey king, is a god. He's also worshipped across the kind of Chinese speaking world as a god. And actually he appears in Blackwater Sister as well.
there's a cameo, yeah.
Yeah, he's got a cameo. And so when I was growing up, I was watching these like Hong Kong TV series, which would I guess are fantasy series, and you'd have these amazing kind of like fights in the sky and really bad special effects and so on. Magic and so on, but they were all kind of, it was all kind of gods were involved. So it's a bit like, I guess it's a bit like what, like the Odyssey, where Guan Yin, the goddess of mercy, would come and like give the monkey king a hand and that kind of thing. And so I think there's something there about the people who made this and the people who watched it were actually also people who would go to the temple and pray to the Monkey King. Like they watch him getting up to kind of shenanigans in this kind of like, family TV series. And then they go and pray to him. So it's something about that kind of division between what you believe and what you kind of what is clearly a fantasy to you is maybe not, it doesn't follow along the same lines necessarily as like I feel like a series about Jesus Christ would just be different.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd just be different.
Well, I suppose the comparison there is with Philip Pullman's novel, The Good Man Jesus and the Scoundrel Christ, which is sort of very deliberately blasphemous in all sorts of ways, and caused a very deliberate fuss when it came out in ways that it doesn't sound like these kinds of obstacles exist in the same way.
Oh no, it's not. Yeah, so the series wasn't blasphemous. Like it was actually, looking back, it was probably it probably favored the Buddhist view of things quite strongly. But then when you read Journey to the West, so I've not finished Journey to the West, the book, and actually I didn't finish the series either. I don't think this is like really like they're like three different, they're those specific that specific series. There's like three separate series of those, and then there's obviously loads and loads of adaptations of Journey to the West generally. But I did start reading Journey to the West some years ago in translation into English. And actually there's a really strong like Buddhist versus Taoist agenda. Like there's a lot of fights where like Sun Wukong goes in and he's a Buddhist and he beats up all these like corrupt Taoist priests. So there's a lot going on there. But in terms of the series itself, it wasn't presented. It's not it's not like kind of Philip Pullman stuff where it's like it's gonna offend somebody. Like the kind of followers of the faith are particular, that's completely consistent with the worldview.
We have a question from Lynn, which kind of bears on this in some ways, which is about how your family has experienced your interventions into this conversation, I suppose. Is it something that kind of, how do they feel about your work, I suppose is the question then.
They're not that great at reading my work, which is helpful, actually. So like I think my mum's the only one who's actually read any of the books. And she's not actually, I'm not sure if she's read Backwater Sister yet. And she's not talked to me about it. She did get quite offended by a really passing line, because actually my parents converted to Christianity a few years ago. I grew up kind of Taoist/Buddhist, but they converted. And then and after this conversion, my mum read, I think, The Perilous Life of Jade Yo, which is a kind of novella I self-published years ago, which is historical romance set in the 1920s. And actually it's one of my few kind of published non-fantastical works. And there's kind of like a passing line about the protagonist reading the Bible for the dirty bits, basically, and she got quite offended by that and sort of told me to step off that sort of topic. But and I said, well, just don't read it. It's gonna offend you, basically. So yeah, we haven't. There's not a lot of yeah, they don't seem that worried about it. I mean, I think it's definitely the way I write about it is very removed from, well, like the reality of the practice. I think there's a very clear kind of distinction. There might also be a degree of like this story that my mum tells that I always kind of has stuck in my head. She used to have a colleague who was Malay Muslim who was very scared of going in cemeteries, like didn't like going to graveyards in Malaysia because he was worried about the ghosts. And kind of getting in spiritual trouble. And then he went to the UK on holiday and was telling everyone about like this graveyard he'd visited while he was here. And they said, what's up with that? Why did we would have thought you wouldn't want to go. And he said, oh, but they're all white ghosts. They're not worried about me. They're not gonna bother me. And I think there's a degree of that. I think now, like maybe now that they're Christian, I think they feel kind of maybe defended against that kind of that spiritual world. Although my mom's she's a very syncretic Christian, I have to say. I think it's not that she thinks that it's not that she stopped believing in all the Chinese spirits and gods and so on. She just thinks that like that joke about friends, like why does not Ross as the largest friend not simply eat the other friend? And like Jesus is the largest god now, and he will he will simply eat the other gods.
That's also sorry to stay on Blackwater Sister. There's a moment in that where a Christian family member tries to do a bit of a light exorcism, and you leave it ambiguous as to whether, because the ghost then does go away, but there are several other plausible reasons for that, and it feels like you're almost deliberately leaving all the options on the table for those sorts of interactions between cultures of the spirit, I suppose. There's a question in there's a question from Briner, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, which kind of bears on this a little bit. This sort of the way that the tropes of these beliefs kind of are useful and intersect with each other. So you mentioned having fun working against common perceptions of creatures, like seeing dragons do mundane or silly things. And incidentally, to judge from the chat, that collection about stressed millennial dragons is going to have a few guaranteed sales if you ever do get round to it. How do you determine what tropes or perceptions to use more directly and which ones to subvert?
I think it's not that analytical. It's kind of whatever draws me to, it's kind of inherent in the idea. So if at first you don't succeed, as I said, I was kind of thinking a lot about kind of failure and success at the time. And this idea of an Imugi who gives up was what drew me to it.
Mm.
Uh, and then in Sorcerer to the Crown, I mean, this is a spoiler, but whatever. It's not really plot. It's not plot bearing. I have a kind of Bertie Wooster style character who's actually a dragon and he shapeshifts. Um, and that was just a kind of it was just kind of a joke because Bertie Wooster, as those of you who've read P.G. Wodehouse will know, has kind of a couple of terrifying aunts, and so does the kind of Rollo, who's kind of my character, my take on him, and it just really entertained me to have him talking about his aunt and saying, she's got smoke rising from her jaws and she'd eat you as soon as she looks at you.
Mhm.
And then be like, actually, that's all just factually true because she's a dragon. Yeah, so it's not that I think studied, but I think what I often am doing is I take something that I think that is kind of scary or imposing and just like bring it down to earth a bit. Mostly because it's funny. Sometimes it offers a kind of fresh insight. But actually, as I've been going on, like some of the what I'm trying to do is that, but also keeping it kind of scary. So like Blackwater Sister is actually quite dark. It gets
Mhm.
really, yeah.
I'm so glad you mentioned Woodhouse because because I run a class that's sort of world building, studying world building rather than attempting to teach it up here on our master's course, and I put Woodhouse as one of the texts because the argument is that's a world that's built by his aesthetic, by his
He,
prose.
he's
Um,
such a good, yeah, he's such a good example of building world through just that language. Yeah, it's such a distinctive use of language. George Hare does it as well, actually, with this kind of invented Regency, supposedly super accurate. It doesn't matter whether it's accurate or not. It's the world is in how they talk. Patrick O'Brien's really good at this as well, actually, in the Aubrey Maturin novels.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And we think, don't we, of conjuring worlds, yeah, as being something fancy and sci-fi do, but everyone's doing it, and nobody better than the three people you just mentioned, I think.
Yes, yes.
So it was, yeah, I feel vindicated. Thank you very much for that. We've got a question about which kind of bears into this from Beth about kind of if there are any other examples on your to-do list of kind of that of bringing things across the genre divide to kind of bear upon each other. So Hare, Patrick O'Brien, Woodhouse, they all have in common that they are not usually thought of as fantasy writers. Obviously, you're kind of out with the structures of romance and stuff. Are there any other genres, Beth asked, that you would be interested in transforming into fantasy in this way?
So Um, the next fantasy novel I want to write, I've been thinking about it for quite a few years, and I talked to you about it a little bit. But it kind of its kind of earlier manifestation is the Order of the Pure Moon. So where the genre in question is Wuxia, but Wuxia, I guess, I mean, is it fantasy? Is it, people fly through the air when they're doing kung fu, but it's also based on kind of like historical South China and the kind of politics of and kind of, what was going on at that time. Um, but I think the one that I've got in mind wasn't the kind of seed of the idea was inspired by a film called Let the Bullets Fly by the Chinese filmmaker Jiang Wen. and he stars in it as well. There he was basically doing a Western, but like a Western set in the Chinese kind of Republican era, you know, kind of like the warlordy era, the kind of early 20th century. Um, and I thought that was kind of like such an interesting thing to do, to kind of adopt this specific genre, but then like link it to you know, like a different historical moment in a different society. Um, and that's so that I guess there's going to be something of that in the next book, where it's not going to be, I'm not as interested in Westerns. Um, you know, or guns really as Jiangwen. Maybe you have to be a guy to kind of be as invested. But I think there's going to be something about that, and I want to do something that thinks about I don't know, kind of like governance and revolutions and uprisings, and how you kind of affect lasting positive change in society, but also how it kind of goes wrong. I don't know that this is answering the question really, but I'm gonna try to do it in a fantasy way. So I haven't 100% worked out. I suspect it's gonna be more gods and stuff, but we'll see.
It's really exciting. Thank you for the preview. We've got a question from Cora about the balance between your day job and writing fantasy. So I didn't mention this when I introduced you, but you're also a lawyer. And so Cora has read on your blog an article about your background in law and wanted to know how you managed to silence the law mind. That sounds as if Cora might have some experience of their own. When you're writing stories with magic creatures, ghosts, and fantastic worlds. I mean, is there a relationship there for you?
So I work part-time. So that's really helpful. I work 3 days a week. And it's funny, but I was a lawyer before I started writing novels. Actually, I started my job as a lawyer. I started my training contract around the time I started writing short stories for publication. Um, and I think what's helpful in law is that the kind of writing you do for law is so different from creative writing that is, like, to me, the purpose is so clear. Whereas what's really difficult with creative writing, I mean, it's the kind of joy of it, but it's also the responsibility and the terror of it, is that you make your own purpose, right? You're working out what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
And so actually that kind of structure I found kind of helpful. And the thing that made me think I could write a novel, actually, was, funnily enough, was watching a colleague, a senior colleague, draft an 80,000 word witness statement. Basically a novel, but a really boring novel. But like it was for a really interesting case. It was this guy who'd embezzled billions from like the Bank of Central Asian country, um, and actually the challenge was constructing the story for the court to understand that he owned all these shell companies through which the money was owned, all these really Byzantine company structures. And actually, that was why the witness statement was so long, was because it was basically exhibiting all these documents explaining how they connected to each other. And so this Seychelles company is owned by this other, you know, this Jersey company, which is owned by this whatever. And it's ultimately beneficially owned by this brother-in-law of this baddie. But I think seeing that done made me think, and like actually watching how he drafted it made me think, oh, okay, so that's how you draft something that long. You know, it takes a long time. It's the kind of structure of it, and so I think that discipline has been quite helpful to me in my writing. And I enjoy law. It's very, and what's helpful about it is how it's different from writing, and actually academic friends I've talked to about these things agree, which is that it's kind of like that balance between the research and the writing side of things, which is very kind of isolating in a way. You're on your own, you're kind of working through something, takes a long time, and maybe the teaching outreach, that kind of more kind of outward facing part of the role of the academic. And I think my day job gives me that other piece.
I'm sure what you're saying will be familiar to a lot of people who are listening, who are thinking about, you know, their balance between whether it's teaching and research, or whether it's or whether it's that they have their own creative things bubbling away whilst they're doing academic work. it interested me though that that wasn't your answer to the previous question about genres to fantasize, so to speak. That you didn't say the police procedural or Law and Order or are you ever tempted to do a fantasy legal drama, or is
I'm
that
a
too
civil
close?
lawyer. But also I think the distance helps. So Max Gladstone obviously has done these kind of like corporate law kind of like fantasies. His wife is or was a corporate lawyer. She might have moved on by now. But I think that probably was it's having that proximity, but also the distance, I imagined, helped him. So actually, the book I'm writing right now, is a law firm romance, but I haven't worked in, so I worked in a law firm for about 11 years, and then now I work for government. And having that distance is incredibly helpful. I could not have written the book I'm writing now, which is set at a city law firm of the kind that I used to work at, if I was still working at a city law firm. You know,
Right.
it would work. So maybe when I retire from law, I'll do some kind of fantasy based on that. But I think because especially when you're practicing it, you're just like in the detail of it and how it actually works. So that probably leaves less bandwidth for thinking, what would be a kind of interesting fantasy take on this.
Yeah. Yes, there's it's always sort of it's worrying when academics turn to writing novels and then announce that their novel is set in a university, and everyone sort of gets a little panicky. I imagine it's a similar thing. Another genre that we haven't talked about, but which is implicit in a lot of your work, is historical fiction. And we have a question about that from Becky in the Q&A as well. So do you think all historical fiction or historical narratives have an aspect of fantasy to them? This is a lovely question, in my opinion. But for example, Becky says, how we often make characters speak in a way that they might not or didn't, just because that's now the standard for what people expect. And I suppose it's often a thing in historical fiction that we sort of imbue at least a hero character with some surprisingly modern values as well to sort of make them sympathetic, things like that. So what's your relationship with historical fiction like?
Yeah, I think I sort of grew up reading a lot of old books. And actually you'll hear this from a lot of Commonwealth writers where, the libraries that we had access to when I grew up have all these kind of we didn't have a lot of kind of like currently books being currently published, but kind of a lot of old stuff. And especially if you're from a former British colony, then a lot of these kind of old English novelists. And I think actually that was one of my entryways to fantasy. Because what I found actually writing a contemporary romance was that I had a lot more leeway to write like a dead British person in fantasy. Because actually, as everyone knows, everyone in the past has quite a posh British accent, and also that also applies to fantasy worlds, obviously. If you think about it, there's no real reason why the hobbits should have British accents, but they do. And I mean, you could say, oh, well, Tolkien, is from the West Midlands and so on. Well, in that case, why don't they have Black Country accents anyway? but but yeah, so and I think because I had that kind of like early exposure, sort of historical fiction has felt a quite comfortable place to be. Although in general, I've also added that fantasy element because again, I think that distancing from kind of the real history, I find kind of freeing that I'm not kind of tied to kind of historical fact in the same way. I mean, mind you, I could probably write historical fiction without being tied to historical fact. You see many people doing that, but it just like emotionally for me, it's freeing. And I do think there is obviously an element of fantasy in historical fiction. I think something that Ken Liu says, and I'm sure actually I think he's probably quoting somebody else who said it, is that all kind of science fiction is about the present moment, like in all future fiction is about the present moment. And I think that's true of kind of historical fiction as well. It's kind of about you're still working through the kind of issues that interest you as a kind of contemporary person. I do also dislike but because I think fiction should be an opportunity, and fantasy particularly should be an opportunity to think about and explore worlds and visions of reality and ideas that are very different from kind of yours and those of kind of people of kind of like the every like you might meet now. So I do find it frustrating when you kind of read historical fiction and the characters hold views that are, that a kind of very online Zoomer would. It's just like, why don't you just write about the online Zoomers, or why don't you do like an isekai, right, where you're like, you the kind of like that kind of like very popular anime genre where you fall into the video game you're playing, or you fall into the fantasy novel you're playing, and you're a 21st century person then dealing with a kind of that kind of more those norms. I just feel that is kind of more a more compelling way of doing it.
Totally. I'm a Brummie and I went to Tolkien school, and I want to add that I hugely endorse the Black Country adaptation of Lord of the Rings. If anyone wants to make it, I think we need some. I think we need some West Midlands hobbits. I think that'd be good for everybody. Um, that got a single lone clap floating on the screen. I don't know if you
Everyone
can
be
see
like,
that. Yes, whatever other Brummie is listening. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. We're close to running out of time. I'm not going to have time to ask you all of these questions, unfortunately, but there is one here about kind of writing and enjoyment and process. So this is a question from A. Gray, who says, it's interesting to hear, this was a while ago now, I'm afraid, about you using structure or tropes as a way of examining bigger social questions. How does this relate to enjoying the writing process? And I suppose the question I'd tack onto that is, do you enjoy the writing process? Because we heard from CJ Cook yesterday in another keynote a lot about the process of hatred that is involved in creating a manuscript. And kind of so yeah, where enjoyment and fun sits with darkness and hatred in your processes, I suppose the question.
yeah, I do enjoy it. It was almost like there was a flip after True Queen, where I think because I hated True Queen so much, but like before True Queen, I would say 80% of the time I hated writing. And then 20% of the time it was okay. Well, let's put it like 15% of the time it was okay, and 5% of the time it was great. And then like somehow I think True Queen was like so difficult for me that after that, everything I wrote I really enjoyed. Like if at first you don't succeed, The Order of the Pure Moon I wrote after True Queen. I really enjoyed that one actually. And then Blackwater Sister as well. Although it was the first novel I completed after having a baby, and there were definitely times when I was like, oh God, I'm never going to be able to get to the end of this. But somehow it all sort of worked better, and it kind of flowed better, and I sort of felt a bit more like I knew what I was doing. Sorry, what was the rest of the question? It was writing.
It was about how you're kind of it was about how kind of the enjoyment of the writing process goes with your kind of exploration of structure or like bigger topics. So I suppose,
Yeah.
yeah, how do you stop yourself from just having fun? Maybe is the question.
I, I think in order to embark upon certainly a novel, I already need to be thinking about. I need to know that there's something I'm trying to work out, because I don't really know why. Like it's almost like otherwise I'm just like, what's the point of writing it? So for example, the law firm romance, like it's I'm trying to make it more tropey than the first, like than the friend zone experiment. Although I think the friend zone experiment is already pretty tropey, but like it's got like fake dating, it's got like they go to a wedding, all this kind of stuff. But like the thing I knew I was kind of trying to grapple with a little bit was the kind of London professional services market, how it launders the proceeds of global corruption as a very marginal element, like amongst everything else that's going on. But it's almost like I can only deal with that if I come at it kind of like sideways. If I'm like thinking about something else, and like like the fake, like how do I make this fake dating subplot work? And then that also then like sneaks in somehow. But at the same time, if that's not there, then I can't really get going. Like there has to be something that I know I'm
Mm.
trying to work out at the same time. So it doesn't, I guess the answer is that it doesn't affect my enjoyment of the process. It might make like I might worry about it. I might kind of think, am I doing justice to this? Or am I doing it in the right way? But I think in a kind of constructive way that is kind of inspiring and stimulating.
Thank you so much. We're out of time. That's a really good note to end on. I'm very sorry. There are still 3 questions left, which I didn't get to. But I am so grateful for your time and a really interesting talk. And I know that everyone else is as well, because little pictures are flying up on the screen. If we were in a real auditorium right now, I'm sure the walls would be ringing. Thank you so much, Zen. We really, really appreciate you logging on to talk to us today, and that I'm sure your insights are going to power a lot of really good conversations in future panels and on the Discord and so on and so forth.
Oh, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed speaking to you and seeing all the chat and so on. So thanks to everyone.
It's such a pleasure. And yes, thank you for participating in the chat as well. I will send the log of it round to you, Zen, afterwards, so that you can see what people have been saying if you haven't been following it. We've got a 15-minute break now. Actually, it's 14 minutes because I've overrun. I've broken my own rule. 14-minute break, and then the next set of panels start. Thank you so much again, Zen. Thank you to everybody for watching. We'll see you in future sessions.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. So most